No clickbait. You are a combat medic with an emphasis on the combat. You're not like the Warlocks who enjoy sitting at the back of the map. You like watching the worlds on fire up close with constant supers to make it even brighter. Here's the quick build. Solar Warlock with Vesper of Radius. Weapons and their perks are flexible and change based on the GM. The Call with Lead from Gold and Desperate Measures has been my go-to. Still Hunt and False Idols with Incandescent Surrounded, or Promemoria with Reconstruction, Desperate Measures. Song of Flame with Phoenix Dive, Strafe Glide, Incinerator Snap, and Healing Grenade. Aspects are Heat Rises and Hellion. Fragments are Empyrean, Benevolence, Ashes, and Singeing. Here's a screenshot of the armor and artifact mods you'll be using. These change with whatever weapons you'll be running. And for a longer breakdown, stick around. The first and most obvious, why Vesper of Radius? You're not even on Arc, nor are you using an Arc Super. You're not even using Rift. So, why? These are all valid questions, and because of this, I'm going over how the mechanics of the build function first. With this build, every time you dive, you ignite the enemies in front of you and gain Restoration 2. You gain super energy from mods and the ignites you set off. By these enemies dying, you extend the duration of your restoration. Vesper gives you your class ability back in seconds for being close to enemies, which rounds out the build's weak points. You are an engine of immolation. In high density ad content, where you are expected to deal with an excess of enemies, it burns everything to the ground. The more enemies, the better. Snipers can be an issue because you lack the same level of resists as Prismatic, but Song of Flame eases this pain. It felt amazing in Liminality once I figured it out. Because it builds a desirable super quickly, you can use it in GMs, raids, and other content as long as you change out your weapons to match. You can swap for tankiness for certain encounters or more tools for champions. It handles Tormentors with Song of Flame and can stay out of their reach while stun locking them. It's best at short to medium range, but can do medium to long. Look at my abilities in this clip. See how fast they regenerate just for doing what the build wants you to do. So, here's the full breakdown with details to match. If you want to skip the numbers and go directly to gameplay and techniques, go to here. This is how much Vesper gives you. 1,500% class ability regeneration is a lot. It's not what you'll always have, but this is in combination with Benevolence giving 400% and Singeing giving another 400%. Spawns usually pop in with about 3 to 6 enemies. You will be jumping in, igniting them, and moving on. Let's look at the cooldown of Phoenix Dive in realistic situations. You will usually have 3 to 4 enemies near you in any given situation. 5 to 6 will happen, and often, but let's not pretend it will always happen. I have a recovery of 70, which sets my base cooldown of Phoenix Dive to 39 seconds. With Vesper active at the lowest level, the cooldown drops to 14 seconds. With Vesper and Singeing, this drops to 7 seconds. With Vesper, Singeing, and Benevolence, this drops to 4.6 seconds. Now, if we start ramping Vesper up, this goes down to 3.4 seconds, then 2.7 seconds, then 2.3 with 6 enemies around you. Of course, again, this isn't always the case. Alternatively, if you only have Benevolence and Singeing, you'll still be at 5.9 seconds. All of these are enough to set the machine in motion, although we would prefer Phoenix Dive's cooldown as low as possible. So, you are ignoring all the other parts of Vesper in order to play an aggressive healer who takes out threats quickly. How do you do this? Here's where the build comes together. With the Ashes Fragment, a Heat Rises Phoenix Dive and a Hellion Shot gives you an Ignite. So, when you eat your grenade and dive, you cause the enemies near you to detonate, or you can snap. So you receive your dive back for being near enemies, scorching enemies, and healing allies, all of which you do during a dive. You'll receive a minimum of 20% of your melee back per enemy killed while you are in the air. So you receive your dive and melee constantly. And then on top of this, you are running double dynamo and a single distribution. This gives you 11% of your super with each dive near an enemy. But that's not all your dive and grenade do, which both assist you in survival. This is where stuff gets insane, and I do mean that. Eating your healing grenade gives you Cure 3, but that's not what does this. When you Phoenix Dive with Heat Rises active, you receive Resto 2 for 3 seconds. Then, the Empyrean Fragment can extend this restoration by killing enemies with solar abilities or weapons, which is very, very easy for you. But that still doesn't explain this. So, whenever you apply Restoration, your timer will go up to the maximum you've extended it to. This can be anywhere from 3 to 15 seconds, depending on how many enemies you've killed with solar abilities. You have 2 sources to do this with, one of which is Phoenix Dive with an extremely low cooldown. So, in extended engagements, by doing what you are planning to do already, you can give yourself Resto 2 throughout the engagement as long as there are groups of enemies, or if you are scorching enemies or healing allies. This is what makes the build so weapon flexible when you can maintain short to medium range. You can kill off potential threats, then consistently have a super to deal with threats further away or to phase bosses. Because you can generate consistent super energy regardless of whether or not you kill the enemies, you can push in with an aggressive ally, healing them and getting benefits for doing so. Unlike other healing builds, you are incentivized to heal allies in the fray with them. Phoenix diving nearby enemies and allies will help give you back the cooldown alongside setting off an ignite. Throwing a healing grenade will not only reset your Resto 2 back to its maximum extended value, but also provide a partial refund and help boost your other abilities. You dance around enemies, diving and snapping and ducking into cover when you need to. Every time you dive, again, that's a free 11% of your super. You will get back your super multiple times where your teammates only get 1. And if they're popping supers, this helps you to get your next super even faster. On top of this, if you have another Song of Flame Warlock as a teammate, you can start cheerleading, diving up and down as they hand you damage reduction and ability regen, and you give them healing. Not that they need it, but you will get your super back by diving constantly next to them. To not misrepresent anything, I hadn't fully sorted out the Ignite portion of the build in the liminality footage, but wanted to showcase how it's viable and fun in the new GM specifically. What I am looking to show is how often I am getting the benefits of it, and how it becomes more useful the more frenetic the situation becomes. When you can play cover, you can take advantage of this and begin pushing in. Where is this build not good? It's a flexible build, but it can't tank for the team or deal with multiple snipers if you're out of super. The more enemies there are in close quarters, the more this build shines. But if there aren't many enemies or they are sitting at a distance, the build suffers because you can't crank out free super energy alongside ignites. It can still upkeep Resto 2 because the cooldown is lower as long as you're healing allies while scorching enemies, but the ability to gain other benefits, like the super, goes down. It also requires that you be aware of enemies. If you know certain areas have snipers in them, you have to aim to take them out first, either with a super or whatever weapons you've chosen to use. You need to prioritize targets or play around cover while fighting opponents. This build isn't the fastest. We all know Heart Synthos Titan is going to take home the gold on any speedruns. This is a scrappy build, but it cannot delete champions as quickly as certain other builds can, so it loses out unless it's in super. What it does do is make you feel like you have an amazing toolkit to both assist allies while detonating the opposition in a constant display of destruction. How do you do this? The first part is simple. You eat your grenade and then dive next to a clump of enemies. This gives you your super, gives you a free ignite as long as your Hellion is pointed at the enemies you just dived into. You move on to the next group of enemies and snap them, or dive next to them if your dive is already up. Is it that simple? Sort of. There's gunfire going on between these as you play your life and slip in and out of the fray depending on how hectic it is and how many targets there are. You'll be regenerating fast because of your Resto 2, so certain targets are less threatening to you than others, which means you can ignore them until they explode. This build lives and dies on knowing what you're going into. The more you know an area, the better you'll know how to handle it. When you know what you're diving into before you dive, everything starts clicking. Measured aggression is the name of the game. You may not be able to face tank an entire group of enemies without super, but you have the ability to take out threats before they become a problem and generate super doing so. You can also farm enemies off spawn and even bosses, diving nearby them to get additional super energy. When do you pop super? For minor inconveniences. Since you get it back so fast, it's not worth not using. Every time you dive, every time you cause ignitions, or if you get kills using your dealer's choice loadout. That's chunks of super each time. This means that even in low intensity situations where there is a single champion, you can get back anywhere from 1/10 to 1/4 of your super back just by diving nearby it once or twice. There's no reason to save your super unless you're using it for a specific thing like stunlocking a tormentor. Song of Flame can phase bosses and obliterate adds simultaneously. It can crank out orbs for your teammates while you casually detonate spawns with a quick snap, and flip groups of enemies the bird. This is a lot of information in a short span of time, so let me simplify. The build objectives are, you want to be in Song of Flame as often as possible. You want to extend Heat Rises and Resto 2 for as long as possible. You want to use this to dive nearby enemies and get your super as quickly as possible while also detonating everything nearby you. Everything in this build goes towards these objectives. That's why the dealer's choice loadout is nice, but not mandatory. It covers your angles to help you get your super quickly while being multi-champion, but you can run a variety of weapons to aid in your survival and make you less of a glass cannon. This makes substitutions pretty easy. The call is very flexible, and you could run Slice instead of Lead from Gold. You could also run Chill Clip Weapon to deal with overloads. For an arc-heavy GM like Disgraced, Exodus Crash, or Fallen Saber, consider Risk Runner. For a more generalized aided survival, you could run a Glaive. The ideal is something with good handling, so if it has Threat Detector or innately high handling, that's for the best. I've considered Vexcalibur as an option, but it does make it harder to use your snap as often. You could run the Aberrant Action sidearm with Heel Clip Incandescent. Alternatively, Martyr's Retribution when it comes out will be quite good as well. No Hesitation can extend the duration of your resto with Physic. I tried Red Death Reformed, but it felt awkward competing with my Hellion for kills. Buried Bloodline is an obvious potential choice, but I chose not to include it since it's a dungeon exotic, which puts it out of reach for people who don't have the dungeon key or haven't gotten lucky. Navigator for similar reasons. This build is not weapon dependent, so please feel free to experiment. I tried to make this build with Final Shape in mind without going into exotic class items given their difficulty to farm. It went through a lot of iterations and was a lot of fun to figure out. If this video was helpful to you, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. Thanks, and have a good one.